Sagan was an American astronomer who asked the Voyager 1 space probe to take a photo of Earth from 6 billion kilometres away in space, out beyond Pluto, right on the edge of our solar system. Voyager took this picture, which you may not be able to make out the Earth very well, but here it is enlarged with the Earth circled. Carl Sagan said, "Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. Every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam." Carl Sagan thought that the picture underlined two basic human responsibilities: to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. So, I'm going to ask, how are we going in the second of these crucial duties? Are we preserving and cherishing the pale blue dot? And if not, why not? I came across The Limits to Growth quite by accident in 1972, the year it was published. It changed my outlook. It showed me that physics really matters, that the idea of ever-expanding economic growth is a delusion, and that we humans are on a collision course with nature. This book suggested that if we carried on business as usual, our entire system would collapse sometime in the middle of the current century. Business as usual meant ongoing exponential growth. So by 1972, when the book came out, galloping economic growth already seemed normal in the rich world. For me, and anyone younger than I am, it is all we have ever known. But the growth that occurred after World War II finished was not normal. It was absolutely unprecedented in all of human history. There has never been anything like it. Large and rapidly growing populations, accelerating industrial production of every kind, all new. Now, compound or exponential growth always seems rather insignificant in its early stages, but takes off with a bang when the thing being doubled has become massive. Now, there's a Persian legend that illustrates this well, might be familiar to some of you. A king had a debt to a merchant, and the merchant slyly suggested that the king could pay it off in rice on a chessboard. 1 grain on square 1, and doubling the amount on every subsequent square. At square 8, it still looked fairly modest, with only 128 grains required. Now, can anyone guess how many grains the king had to provide at square 41? 2/3. Come on, have a guess.
A lot.
A lot. A trillion. So it's only 2/3 of the way. So this is the kind of thing that happens with exponential growth when it starts going off the charts. So I'll now put this into a practical context. This is the worldwide average of gross domestic product, or GDP, per person since 1800. Now, GDP doesn't mention our well-being or our happiness, just our monetary exchanges. But it's what governments use to measure prosperity. And it also is a bit of a guide to material processes in the economy. And you can see that back in 1800, wealth was very modest, but it gradually increased from about 1870 on. And look at the change of economic pace in 1950. Here's population going from the year 1050, nearly 1,000 years ago, rising very, very slowly from 200 million or more to 7.3 billion today. Notice again what happens around 1950. And here's carbon dioxide emissions, what we get when we burn fossil fuels, and notice the same slow beginning, insignificant before 1850 and skyrocketing around 1950. So we have a bit of a pattern. Now here's a classic case of collapse. An exponential growth that runs out of steam, and in this case runs out of fish. This is the story of the Newfoundland cod fishery, on the North Atlantic coast of Canada. You see here that since the mid-19th century, around 200,000 tonnes of cod were hauled in every year by Newfoundland fishermen. Possibly a sustainable quantity, since it went on for 100 years. But like so many things, the scale and intensity of fishing took off after 1950. For about 10 years, it was a truly fabulous bonanza. But in the late 1960s, over another just 10 years, the catch collapsed. There was a minor short recovery before the cod completely disappeared around 1992. More than 20 years later, there is still little or no sign of them. The fate of the cod can be seen as an example of the growth story in general, of the whole human impact on nature. The Limits to Growth team found that we could avoid a collapse of this kind if we slowed down the physical expansion of the economy. But this would mean two very, very difficult changes: stabilising human population and slowing the entire cycle of physical production, from the material extraction at the beginning through to the disposal of the wastes at the end. But while scientists warned about these problems, they were not heeded by our governments, bureaucracies, media, where economic growth was gradually being entrenched as the central objective of collective human effort. So how did it come about that our leaders turned their back on the warnings about growth? And here are some of the underlying factors and crucial turning points. Around 1900, the modern corporation emerged in the United States. And in just 35 years, the vital industries of the entire country were transferred from thousands of freely competing, locally owned enterprises to giant national corporations. A perpetual process of consolidation followed through the 20th century, and today, less than 150 transnational finance companies control nearly half of all transnational business. Once established, the new corporations were able to develop a massive, not that bit. The new corporations then banded together into industry groups and unions, you might say. Some for specific industries like tobacco, mining, chemicals, and some broad business entities such as the business councils and some international bodies too. These new corporations were able to develop massive industrial capacity, and it soon became necessary to boost people's consumption and to persuade people to buy more lavishly. It was no longer sufficiently profitable to meet obvious human needs. Wants had to be intentionally created and people persuaded to judge ourselves and each other on the basis of material goods. In this way, ever-increasing income and consumption became the meaning of life, at least for us in the rich world. It was not really the meaning of life when I was a young person. So the corporations and their associations exploited the newly emerging public relations industry with a continuous barrage of propaganda, which is still going today. Last year, for example, Peabody Coal signed up a giant PR company for the Advanced Energy for Life campaign, intending to convince world leaders that coal is essential to solve poverty, and to persuade ordinary people like us to embrace the coal industry. From the early 20th century, when working people were first getting the vote, the emerging corporate class could see that PR would be a handy solution to the threat. No one expressed it better than Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, who is credited with founding the PR industry. Bernays was candid. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate the unseen mechanism constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. So the corporate propaganda campaign culminated more recently in the project to, as they said, litter the world with free market think tanks. The American Enterprise Institute and Australia's IPA were among a handful of think tanks that already existed in 1972. But by 2013, there were nearly 7,000 all over the world, predominantly conservative free market advocates, and all of this type financed by big business. They cultivate a studied appearance of independence. They're tax exempt, but as one think tanker wrote, the funding of think tanks is always about efforts to shape and reshape the climate of public opinion. They ceaselessly argue that governments should wind back regulation, privatise their services, balance budgets, lower taxes, control the unions and facilitate business. And for anyone who follows current affairs, that little list would be extremely familiar. The oil shortages of the 1970s triggered an economic crisis that helped bring conservative leaders Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to power, and gave what we in Australia call economic rationalism its chance. As this transition took hold, economic priorities superseded all other values, and corporate self-interest was increasingly freed from democratic control by governments. By the end of the 20th century, this ideology had been accepted almost everywhere. So one more key element in the growth story happened well before this ideological shift of the think tank era since 1970, and it coincided with that acceleration of growth we saw in the graphs around 1950. This was called the bigger pie strategy, and it emerged explicitly right after the war, where the emphasis increasingly fell on baking a bigger pie so the slices could get bigger, even the crumbs, but the pie would not be divided up any differently. There was no consideration of where the ingredients for such a gargantuan pie were going to come from. Now, it's frequently claimed that the big pie growth is lifting millions out of poverty, but this is not really the case. $2 a day is the World Bank's definition of poverty, but it's a very miserable level where a person lacks real daily security for food and water, with little access to sanitation, health, or education, healthcare. And there are still 2.5 billion people living at this level, a third of the people on Earth. And about 1 billion people are still what is called extremely poor, living even closer to the edge. So after 70 years of galloping economic growth, with the world economy now 8 or 10 times bigger than it was in 1950, the actual numbers in all the World Bank's categories of poverty are at least the same as they were in 1980, and probably more. So even as it devastated nature, our conspicuous economic growth still failed to meet its promise of redressing poverty. We are well into dangerous ecological territory in 4 areas, and that means dangerous for us as well as the living creatures we share the planet with. Firstly, species are going extinct 1,000 times faster than the ordinary background rate through geological time. In Australia, the situation for our small marsupials, gotta love them, and our woodland birds is dire. They're going rapidly. The actual rate of species loss suggests that we are already in a mass extinction event, where a majority of all species may be wiped out. In the past, such events were caused by violent volcanic or tectonic plate activity, or in the case of the dinosaur extinction, which is the last on this list, a massive strike from space is thought to have played a big part. The current wave of destruction of life on Earth, the 6th extinction, is being caused by us. And here's a glimpse of the context of that great extinction. Now here you can see the relative mass or weight of humans and our domesticated animals and pets among all land mammals. Notice our cattle are even heavier than we are ourselves. Those few green squares around the edges are all that's left of the wild animals, about 3% of mammal mass on Earth, a fraction of the wild world that was here even in 1950. Second, the nitrogen cycle is completely disrupted. Now in nature, nitrogen is pretty largely inert in our atmosphere. Today, mainly through making fertiliser, nitrogen is flooding through our waterways, causing dead zones and fish kills. Phosphorus also floods our waters, and phosphorus is becoming scarce as well, with terrible implications for agriculture, especially in Australia, where our soils are very poor. Thirdly, land use. We are clearing 1 million square kilometres of vegetation every year. The tropical forests of Asia and Africa, and increasingly Central America, are being replaced by palm oil plantations, and in Latin America by cattle pastures and soybean largely. This deforestation compounds the species loss, obviously, and further disrupts the Earth's inbuilt climate control systems, which rely on trees. And so we come to global warming, the fourth great ecological danger. So we're well on our way to a very hot planet. Unless we change rapidly in the extremely near future, we risk an overall increase of 4 degrees Celsius by 2100. This is climate scientists' belief. So far, the massive Greenland ice cap is melting, and the continental glaciers of the Andes and Himalayas, which supply drinking water to billions of some of the poorest people. Earlier this year, scientists found signs of irreversible melting in West Antarctic glaciers such as Pine Island. This iceberg, carved from the Pine Island Glacier in 2011, it was 1.5 times the size of Greater Canberra. And even in East Antarctica, that's the right side, the big part, there is evidence that the Totten Glacier, outlined in blue, is also thinning fast and speeding up as warm water undermines it. There's 3.5 metres of sea level rise in Totten alone. All these grave changes are happening now with less than 1 degree increase. 4 degrees is beyond imagining. It might take centuries to get to this sort of situation, but once it's got momentum, humans may not be able to stop it. But if New York City goes under, well, so will Eco-Atlantic. Through it all, there is a great clash of values. The economists and corporations see the human economy, rather than the physical planet, as the primary #1 system. Now this is really bizarre when you consider that the planet's been here for about 4.5 billion years and life very close to 4. The barely visible yellow strip at the end of this timeline represents the modern human era, and the 20th century is just a mere sliver of that yellow strip. For physical scientists, on the other hand, the primary system is the planet, and it's self-evidently finite. The human economy, with its relentless extraction and colossal wastes, exists, or tries to exist, entirely within the Earth system. I started out as a student of human history. I was a historian, and I've ended up studying the intersection between human history and natural history. We've had local effects before, but on a global scale, this collision is new. This is the very first time one species, ours, has taken over the entire planetary system for its own sole use. In human-focused terms, this may seem perfectly reasonable. In planetary terms, it's weird and completely impractical. So while our best agricultural land, the last remnants of white box woodland in New South Wales, and the Great Barrier Reef are all put at risk for the extraction of gas and coal, which we ought to stop burning anyway if we want a livable world, it seems that only citizen solidarity and citizen revolt is left to counter it. In this, we must succeed. The ground of our being is at stake. Thank you.